Tonight, the executive director of the Palm Springs Art Museum is responding to an open letter that criticizes the museum for not immediately denouncing the actions surrounding the death of George Floyd. I spoke with Louis Grouchos about that letter, the impact from the pandemic, and how the museum will be different when it reopens. Louis, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start by asking you about this letter, this open letter that is circulating on social media. It's gathered dozens of signatures, and in it, it says, the Palm Springs Art Museum, which sits on sacred Cahuilla lands, has failed to rise up and use its platform to speak against the racism that is prevalent within its own walls and throughout its broader desert communities. At this point, silence equals complicity, neutrality equals complicity. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, being neutral is being complicit. There's no question. But the museum actually did respond. We respond slowly, but we did respond, and it was strategic because, frankly, museums are a complicated institution, entity, organization, multi-layered, and we were very sensitive to the many important issues that were raised in the letter, given the circumstances historically in terms of racism, discrimination, not hearing the voices of generations of members of our community here, obviously, and this is obviously an issue that reaches not just the nation, but it's a worldwide issue, as you can tell from the response to Mr. Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. So I think the letter, we obviously take with great seriousness that there are many of the issues that were addressed in that open letter are critical to not just the Palm Springs Art Museum, but I think our communities at large, including the debate that's happening with art museums throughout the country. And we're very much part of that conversation. And frankly, we embrace the conversation in terms of working toward creating not only a more diverse, a more respectful, and a much more engaged relationship with our community.
This has certainly been a very challenging time for all museums because of the pandemic. Are you coping with it well? Do you think that you're going to be able to reopen soon?
Yes, our plan is really, obviously, we have to look to our governor, our county, and our local government for leadership in terms of the process of reopening the museum. We have are planning for an opening in the fall. We don't know exactly what day, but it will take this opportunity to really prepare the museum for reopening. That will include a new way of receiving our guests, really very much concerned about observing the issues of social distancing. And for a museum culture, which is it really embraces social gatherings. I mean, the reality of our museums over the last 20, 25 years is that we have become cultural gathering places. I mean, we encourage major openings, lectures, programs, and for the Palm Springs Art Museum, that our free Thursday night evenings. I mean, these are enormously successful events that really bring hundreds and in some cases thousands of people together. So we have to rethink how we're going to re-enter into building a new way of a new model to operate until there's a vaccine in place. So it'll be a mediated reopening where we'll probably limit the number of people at any given time in the museum. We're going to be thinking through how we install our exhibitions, ensuring that there are no points of or opportunities for our audiences to cluster, to really design the show to create a new pathway to go through an exhibition comfortably. And then, of course, the obvious is really wearing masks, using plexiglass at the admissions desk, encouraging people to use their apps and their iPhones for both advanced ticketing. We're even talking about removing all labels and text panels and putting it into an app so people don't have to congregate in one space to read a panel, for example, the way you would see at a museum, that often the entry points or the information zones inside the galleries are a point where people will congregate.
What has been the financial impact of this pandemic on the museum?
Oh, it's devastating. When you shut down your revenue line, you really end up relying on the outstanding support from our trustees and our membership, who really are keeping the museum afloat. So we're very fortunate to have a very strong donor base, which really helps the museum tremendously. And we're especially relying on that support during these days when the museum is closed.
Louis, prior to this interview, I asked our viewers if they wanted to submit questions for me to ask you. This question comes from John. Ask whether paying members will be compensated for annual membership that was largely unused the last 3 months during the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you.
Simple answer, of course they will. In fact, we not only will they be compensated, in cases where we've had to cancel programming, we have been very diligent about repaying folks who, for example, paid for the music program, the Cabaret 88. Those funds are going back to those who bought tickets. So we'll be very conscious of that. We'll have a policy and a strategy in place, but we will certainly honor our membership for sure.
Louis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.